Hello everyone, thanks for coming. As John Milton said, fit audience though few. So we are the elite, aren't we, talking about something cultural here, so that's good to see. Okay, so I'm going to talk about a few songs by Robert Bloomfield, which we're going to hear Peter and Joanne perform in a short while. But if you'll indulge me, I just want to say a little bit about Robert Bloomfield and the composer of these songs, who set these poems to music, R.W. Evans. So, with the publication of The Farmer's Boy in the spring of 1800, sorry, I've just changed the picture here, Suffolk farmer's boy turned London lady's shoemaker, Robert Bloomfield, dramatically outsold contemporary volumes of poetry such as William Wordsworth and Samuel Coleridge's Lyrical Ballads. His four later collections, Rural Tales from 1802, Wildflowers from 1806, The Banks of Wye from 1811, and May Day with the Muses from 1802, also sold in significant numbers. Georgian Great Britain's poetry reading public were fascinated by this apparently natural genius, a labouring class writer with little formal education who could write such moving and memorable poetry, often with a political message, or at least a socially critical message. Examples of such aspects of Bloomfield's poetry might even today resonate in the context of Singapore's financially generated, sustained transition from green to grey. As Bloomfield says in a passage from his poem The Broken Crutch, and if you'll indulge me, I'll perhaps just read this passage, okay. I can't reach the mic, I'll have to do it this way, okay. On thy calm joys, with what delight I dream, thou dear green valley of my native stream. Fancy o'er thee still waves the enchanting wand, and every nook of thine is fairyland, and ever will be, though the axe should smite in gain's rude service and in pity's spite. Thy clustering alders, and at length invade the last poplars that compose thy shade. Thy stream shall then in native freedom stray, and undermine the willows in its way. These, nearly worthless, may survive this storm, this scythe of desolation called reform. No army passed that way, yet are they fled, the boughs that when a schoolboy screened my head. I hate the murderous axe, estranging more the winding veil from what it was of yore, that e'en mortality in all its rage, and all the change of faces in an age. Warmth will they term it, that I speak so free? They strip thy shades so dear to me. Indeed, throughout the 19th century, even after his early death in poverty in Bedfordshire in August 1823, and continuing well into the 1880s, Bloomfield remained a highly popular poet, his shorter poems being regularly set to music. By the turn of the 20th century, however, in an increasingly industrialised and modernised Britain, Bloomfield had been quite forgotten. Only in the last decade or so has a serious reclamation and reappraisal of this vibrant labouring class poet begun. And that's probably got something to do with a kind of globalised consciousness about ecology, which perhaps is even affecting Singapore to some degree. And so perhaps that's something that gets us thinking about poets like Bloomfield, who are interested in talking about labour on the land and connection with the land, which is perhaps in Singapore hopefully something we can reconnect with. Today we will focus on composer R.W. Evans' 1824 settings of three of Bloomfield's poems. They were first published as part of the Remains of Robert Bloomfield, an ultimately unsuccessful project to raise funds for the late poet's impoverished family. And just so it happens, I've got a copy here. I'm sorry to say, I'm just a bit frightened of anything happening to it, that you might eat your bee-hoon off it or something. But you can perhaps come and see me at the end if you want to have a look at it. But the music that we're going to hear, the original kind of publishing of it, is in here. How old is it? 1824, almost as old as Singapore, in one of its incarnations. Okay. The volume was edited by Bloomfield's friend Joseph Weston and assisted by Bloomfield's daughter Hannah. In his introduction, Weston described Bloomfield as one of the most perfect poets of his day, and also commended Bloomfield on his purity of taste. Very few touch with a hand so delicate the finest sensibilities of the heart, or lead the affections with such gentle force to virtue and to happiness. Later in Remains, Weston provides us with a prospectus for a projected volume of Bloomfield poems set to music to raise money for the Bloomfield family. Ultimately, this did not go ahead due to a lack of forthcoming subscribers, but we can see from the prospectus that the 3 songs performed in this lecture were to be part of a projected volume comprising of 32 songs, of which it seems only 14 were ever set to music. For Weston, writing in the prospectus, "The songs of the late Mr. Robert Bloomfield are justly esteemed for the purity of their sentiment and the beauty of their poetry. No poet displays the influence of the tender passion with more feeling, and very few treat the amiable objects of it with so much delicacy and respect. On this account, he has always been a favourite with that sex, whose approving smile he always valued as his best reward." Okay, so much for Bloomfield, but what of the composer of these songs, R.W. Evans? Unfortunately, we know next to nothing about him. For the information I cite here, I'm grateful to fellow Bloomfield enthusiast Dr. Kerry Davis. COPAC, a library database, which some of you may be familiar with, bringing together the catalogues of over 70 major UK and Irish libraries, yields a handful of songs by Evans, suggesting that he was a professional musician working in the theatre in the late 1810s into the 1820s. The possibility gestures to Bloomfield's own involvement with the London theatre, both as theatre-goer and writer, as well as the drama and theatricality present in many of Bloomfield's poems. Excuse me. Ancestry.co.uk lists a Robert William Evans, baptised 17th of June 1787 at St Mary Whitechapel. He is the presumably illegitimate son of George Bland, and Rachel, surname not given, a minor actor called George Bland, was the brother of Dorothy Jordan, actress and mistress of William IV. Could this actor and brother of a royal mistress have been the father of the songs? The father of the composer of the songs we'll hear Joanna and Peter perform today. Just to say a few things about the songs before Joanna and Peter play them. I'll say a few words about each poem song, and then we will hear them performed by Joanna and Peter. Excitingly, this lecture marks the first occasion that these songs have publicly been performed in over a century. So to this vast audience, they're just about to be performed. Okay, the poems, at first glance, perhaps rather sentimental and slight, have also been neglected by Bloomfield scholars. I have put the poems on the handout so you can actually see the words, if not the music. Okay. So, first of all, let's say a few things about, we're going to hear the dawning of the day, okay? This short poem is first collected in Remains. Nothing is known of its earlier composition or history. It is described in the subtitle as a hunting song, and for me its positive portrayal of the rather barbaric sport of fox hunting goes somewhat against Bloomfield's seemingly ahead of his time positive and sympathetic views on animal rights expressed elsewhere in his poetry. Perhaps Bloomfield and or Evans were hoping to cash in on the popularity of hunting songs in this period. Again, there was no TV or internet then. Okay, the poem was anthologised at both ends of the 19th century in, first of all, the Apollo, a collection of the most popular songs, recitations, duets, glees, choruses, etc., intermixed with many originals, and that was in 1830. It was popular enough to feature in R.B. Peake's dramatic hunting extravaganza, which was like an illegitimate play that was put on, The Meltonian. So it's actually on the stage in Drury Lane and in central London in 1838. Dawning of Day was also anthologised as late as 1901 in the Poetry of Sport, Badminton Library of Sports and Pastimes. In this song, an old hunter recalls past joys of the dawn fox hunt, and how the hunter's cry and horn still inspires him to take part in the dawn hunt, defying his own age and dwindling strength. The poem ends, "And shall I relinquish this joy of my heart, while years with my strength roll away? Hark the horn, bring my horse, see they're ready to start. Tally-o, at the dawning of the day."
Passions, the feelings of
Okay, the second song we're going to hear is called The Maid of Landoga. Okay, this poem features in Bloomfield's long 1811 poem, The Banks of Wye, which is a poetic account of his 1807 week-long tour around the Wye Valley with a party of friends. The Wye is a truly picturesque spot. Indeed, through William Gilpin, the area is forever associated with the adjective picturesque, which is perhaps overused these days. It's a kind of technical term for looking at a certain kind of landscape in a certain way. So we use picturesque in a quite slippery way. So perhaps it's interesting to go back to Gilpin to think how he used it. Okay, celebrated most famously in William Wordsworth's lines composed a few miles above Tintern Abbey. Let's say every Singapore schoolboy or schoolgirl would have at one time known that poem. But we're looking at Bloomfield, less kind of canonically central. Okay, just another view of this is Landoga now, today. I don't think it's grown very much. It's not like Singapore. It hasn't expanded exponentially in 2 months or something. It's stayed over centuries about the same size. Okay, The Maid of Landoga, so Landoga in Wales, is featured in Book 2 of The Banks of Wye as the party visit travelling from Tintern Abbey, encounter Landoga, or I can't do the Welsh, Llandogo, a small village in Monmouthshire, South Wales, located between Monmouth and Chepstow in the lower reaches of the Wye Valley, 2 miles north of Tintern. The village is set on a steep hillside overlooking the River Wye and across into the Forest of Dean in Gloucestershire, into England. Bloomfield describes the village in a passage. Delightful village, one by one thy climbing dwellings caught the sun, so bright the scene, the air so clear, young love and joy seemed stationed here. Simon White has described Bloomfield's insertion of the Maid of Landoga, so it's this lyrical poem in the midst of a kind of narrative or verse diary of his trip around the Wye, and 2 other songs in the Banks of Wye as representing the living popular culture of the labouring poor. So Bloomfield trying to claim back sort of, what should we say, kind of democratised culture for a more kind of genteel reading audience rather than the kind of more highfalutin high culture of people like Wordsworth and Coleridge and other poets. In the poem, a local maid protests to her absent love that the distant and foreign climes and glories he is currently searching for, and perhaps encountering abroad, cannot compete with the domestic joys of Landoga, Wales' home. In Bloomfield's taking on here of a local labouring class woman's voice, love, truth, together with home and the picturesque, seem inextricably linked in the maid's calling her lover to return. The poem ends, can lands where false pleasure assails thee, and beauty invites thee to roam, can the deep orange grove charm with shadows of love, thy love at Landoga bewails thee, remember her truth and thy home. final song we're going to hear this morning is called The Flowers of the Mead. And perhaps deceptively, this seems the slightest of the works we're looking at. It's often said that poets' worst poems are the ones that are set to music, the ones that seem to be most insipid and most kind of bland, because there's plenty of room for musicians to do odd and weird things with them, even with William Blake, who I'm a specialist in, really. His seemingly worst poems are the ones that seem to be set to music. But I just wonder with The Flowers of the Mead, what exactly is going on in this poem? Is it as simple as it seems? Okay. So this poem, all we know is that it was collected in 1824 for The Remains of Robert Bloomfield, the book which I hope is still behind me, hasn't been disappeared. We don't know its history elsewhere. It may have been published somewhere else, it may have been known somewhere, but the scholarship has not revealed anything about its kind of former history. But when it was published in 1824, it did seem to become extremely popular and did kind of circulate as a song. Okay. And it is the only song of those we're going to hear this morning included in the recent 2007 edition of Bloomfield Selected Poems. I think I hinted that there's kind of a renaissance or a kind of recovery in Bloomfield that's kind of going on. That's been marked in the last 20 years by an actual selected poems. We haven't got a collected poems yet. He's not up there with Wordsworth and Coleridge in that sense, but at least we have a selected poems. And one of the poems that was chosen by John Goodridge and John Lucas for that collection was this, The Flowers of the Mead. So obviously they found it interesting, but frustratingly no critic has really said anything about it, so it's up to me to try and scratch my head and kind of say something. And I haven't got very much to say, just to show my kind of doubt about it. You've got the lyrics there, I'm sure you'll be able to say far more kind of perceptive things than me about the poem. But it just strikes me that, deceptively simple as it is at first glance, Bloomfield appears to proffer the unassuming but beguiling idea that though we cannot converse with flowers, it is in fact through their silence as well as their beauty that they perpetually move us. So that's, an interesting idea perhaps, but not necessarily a very original one. Lots of poets from from Chaucer and I'm sure beyond have talked about flowers and their kind of imagery and what that possibly means. But one starts to wonder, after several readings or hearings of this poem, is Bloomfield really talking about the flowers? Or is he talking about other metaphorical flowers of the mead? Okay, I just wanted to quote the final stanza of the poem. Oh, I don't think I've got a pretty picture or anything, have I? I think I've run out of pictures. So we just have to use our imagination for this one. Okay, but to quote the final stanza, "But silent they stand," presumably the flowers, "yet in silence bestow what smiles and what glances impart, and give every moment joy's exquisite glow and the powerful throb of the heart." really, I expected to kind of end on that note. But we've reached through our time. In my anxiety not to bore you to tears, and because the songs are quite short, our kind of presentation proper is finished. But I suppose this would be a great opportunity to perhaps, well, first of all, I'd like to thank Peter and Joanne for making this possible. Without sounding very sentimental, this is a dream come true for me in some ways, because I see these bits of music that I can't read in a book that's kind of 200 years old, and it seemed magic to me that they've kind of brought it to life and manifested physically these songs in such a wonderful manner. But also, yes, I mean, it would be wonderful if, you know, the spirit of Bloomfield could have been here to have heard them performed and so forth, which he didn't, unfortunately, because he'd died by the time that the music was composed for this. But maybe, could I ask you, Peter, perhaps maybe you'd be willing to say something about from a musician's perspective, anything about the songs?
I'll just say five minutes about the songs.
Okay, yep.
Take that first one, The Dawning of Day. You can see that you get this rather trite word painting, you know, at the beginning, which sounds like the horns coming over. And these are songs of their time, as Eugene keeps pointing out to me, really, because I say that they are rather trite, they're rather trivial. The quality of the composition is nothing like the same quality of, say, other songs that are being written at the same kind of time, which would have been by Schubert and Schumann. Sure. Those are songs that have survived. So I think R.W. Evans, whilst he's a perfectly competent composer and everything works, that it is rather shallow and trite in its very simplistic. I use the word in its true sense, in a rather simplistic word setting there. But it's fun and it works, and they're certainly very pastoral. Let's have a look at the second one that we did was the Maid of Landoga, wasn't it? Yeah. Well, very difficult to make it really interesting, you know. And a long introduction, so there's obviously a sense in which the pianist and the singer are being treated as equals here, which was again part of a movement at the time. These are the long introductions of the Schumann songs, and the long intros and outros, as we might call them now. And there would have been songs that would have been sung in the average middle class, upper middle class household, I think, as you said, before the age of television and electronic devices. You think of Jane Austen, every young lady would have been expected to have had a certain number of social skills, and those social skills would have included sewing, needlework, playing the piano, or playing the harpsichord, or whatever. Well, actually, a piano at this time. So I think that's all part of why we have these rather long intros and outros on the keyboard. So it's a fairly even and equal partnership between voice and piano. And the third one, The Flowers of the Mead. Same really. We get another long introduction. In my interpretation of it, my performance of it, such as it was, I think to modern ears, sounds a little overphrased, you know, because that would have been a rather 19th century romantic way of performing it. So what I was trying to do was to get somewhere between how it might have been played in 1824 and what is acceptable to modern ears. And also that the Dawning of Day, this one, that's written pianissimo throughout. Then you get... Where does that come from? And where does it leave your soprano? And then so I took the edge off it a little bit in the performance, not to try and make it quite as pianissimo and fortissimo as it's actually written here. So again, I think it reflects a slight inadequacy or relative poor quality of the composition of the song. But fun to do. I've enjoyed doing them, and thank you very much, Angus, for introducing them to us. And I hope that what we've done today has been what you wanted to do.
Oh, most definitely. But could I ask about the you're talking about the not to spring to Evans's defence, but could the simplicity and the triteness, it may have something to do then with the fact that these were written to be sold and performed in homes by amateurs and things.
Yes,
so, yeah.
Yes, absolutely. And I usually make that point, and I tried to indicate that, that this would be before people had televisions and things to listen to. Then this is how they would have entertained themselves. Indeed, as a child, we didn't have television when I was a boy, and my family did entertain itself like this. I'm that old.
You don't look at me.
Thanks.
Well, thanks very much.
Yeah.
Perhaps could we ask Joanne? Joanne, I don't want to put you on the spot, but just from your perspective, you were saying something a little bit about performing the songs. It's not necessarily your cup of tea, but
personally, because the range is not as comfortable for me because I'm a mezzo soprano, but I would think that if it's in the context of a home, then probably it would be fine, but not for. I would think, I don't know, for formal setting it would pass, because I do agree with Mr. Stead that the composition is rather simplistic in that sense, yeah.
But you're setting the bar quite high, aren't you? Schumann and Schubert sort of thing.
Yeah. Sadly, yeah, because I guess those are the classics, so we tend to not really compare, but we tend to use that as the backbone. Because currently I'm working on a Schumann song cycle, and so you hear the disparity between the tone qualities, the use of phrasings, the use of the chord progressions. You see that there's quite a big gap between them. Yeah. So, but in terms of technicality, there is still technicality. So if we say that we perform this at home in that context, technically it's still challenging. So it still requires some technique in that sense.
And you were mentioning as well, weren't there are other songs that are included in the Remains of Robert Bloomfield, and some of them are more technically kind of demanding, aren't they?
Yeah, technically,
so there seems to be a range there. So I should think if this book had actually been published of 32 songs or whatever, it would have been for, let's say, amateurs and advanced, wouldn't it? There would be singers and pianists.
Well, they're absolutely characteristic of their time.
Yeah.
And nothing wrong with that at all. And as we were saying earlier, what tends to happen is that the works of real quality are the ones that tend to survive. Which is why we see Schumann and the likes surviving to this day, and R.W. Evans sadly passed into the mists of history.
Well, I wonder. Call me a Philistine, but the Flowers of the Mead, I don't know why I find that a real earworm to me. That really kind of, I think because I'm starting to hear it over and over again or something. But there seems to be a charm for me about it. But maybe we can fight about that later. I don't know. Massive audience. I don't know if you had any kind of questions or anyone wanted to make any observations. It'd be really interesting to hear what you think.
The one that struck me rather interestingly was the Dawn of the Day. Right? Is that called? Yeah. Yes. Well, the hunt is there, and then, of course, what tends to happen when you're caught between language and music, or music in language and language in music, is you see the irony. I'm not sure if Evans actually intended that, but, the hounds are the music for me, which actually is a rather ironic turn of phrase. It sounds very jolly, and it sounds very strident, and yet the cry of the hound, taken out of the musical context and left in a lyrical, dramatic context, then points out to, the fear of the animal being hunted, and, the cry, if you like, of the predator through the hound. And I just wonder how much of that interchange between language or music and text actually gets lost in the whole process. And, of course, I don't wish to defend anyone, but in the case where music is simplistic enough for the text to have its way in the enactment of that text, I'd imagine if the music was any more complicated, then it might have complicated the text.
Right.
I mean, that's one way of looking at Evans' simplistic way of writing, because if you had complexity with the musical structures and the complexity of the text, particularly the subtexts, then it might make for a a blurring of the edges, if you like, for the clarity of the song as a whole.
Yes. Yeah, there's a lot to think about there. Yes. Sorry, Peter.
No, I was going to say, if it had been submitted as an O-level exercise, I would have said it was quite good. any further, and I think I would have sent this student back to rethink his composition. You see where? But yeah, very much of their time.
But interesting the point you're making there, Eugene, because as I said, I found this quite an anomaly. But that Bloomfield seems to talk about animal rights in big terms, and is well ahead of his time in other poems and so forth, talking about how badly horses are treated and other animals and so forth. Particularly the whole idea about we're all keen on New Zealand lamb nowadays, but he really sees that as a very strange idea. A baby sheep, getting it killed and so forth, and we all enjoying it for our Sunday lunch is something that he finds, almost like a kind of perversion of nature. So he's kind of ahead of his time. He's almost like some kind of proto-vegetarian or something from the way he's talking.
That contradiction is still there in the UK in the defence of hunting even today.
Yes.
And it is the people in the countryside who nurture the land and look after the animals who are the ones who are very much in favour of hunting.
And badger culling, as we have at the moment.
Yeah, so it's contradictory to those of us who are townies, I think.
Right,
but they don't see it as such, because it's a way of controlling vermin, controlling damaging animals.
Indeed, yes.
And to the greater good. So hunting is a positive thing in their eyes.
But a good excuse for some kind of sadism against animals, but there we go. Good to not to say I'm partisan in any way talking about these things, but I thought from what Eugene was saying, I thought again giving some interesting kind of depth to at least the poem, if not the music of Dawning of the Day, to think in some ways what have we got there? This elderly huntsman going, but one day he's not going to be able to listen to the dawn. Noises, the horn and so forth, and to get up and hunt because he'll be ill and he'll be dead, and perhaps that's a kind of undercutting as well as this whole idea about the fox and the cruelty that lies behind all this jolliness of middle class people in red coats with beagles and horses having a good old time. Okay, brilliant. Anything else? Anybody? Go on, your chance to talk at this historical moment. No pressure.
Were there other composers who have set his text to music?
Yes, there are quite a few, not anyone really famous. In fact, before he died, quite a few people were setting these to music, and Bloomfield was involved in, because he knew that he'd be able to sell, more poems, books of poetry, get more publicity. So there was a composer called William Shield. He was trying to get him to write settings of all four of the songs that are in the Banks of Wye, but I don't think, for some reason, it didn't come off. But also his brother Isaac was a composer, so Bloomfield's brother Isaac set about
the one that we didn't perform today, Rosie Hannah.
Yes,
that was set by Isaac.
And that seems more competent as a composition. From what you were saying, so I mean that's kind of quite interesting. If this project had gone ahead in 1824. I'd imagine there would be at least 7 or 8 different composers, whose settings would have been included. And all through the 19th century, I think there must have been, let's say, about 100 different settings of his music. And so that's kind of quite interesting. He's completely forgotten in the 20th century, but in the 19th century, even though he dies in 1824, through settings of his songs, his poems, and through his poetry, he seems to strike a chord. He's not a Victorian poet, and these aren't Victorian settings, but the Victorians seem to love this kind of Georgian stuff, and it kind of lived on. Maybe that says something about them harking back to an age before, kind of industrialisation, like Singaporeans, some of them, quietly harking back to the age of the kampong, perhaps. I don't know. Possibly. It could be a bit like that. Any other thoughts? Okay. Right.
Thank you very much,
Thanks
Angus.
so much.
Thank you so much.